Evelyn sat beside the window, watching the world pass her by in fragments of mist and carriage wheels. Her sisters spoke of ballrooms, poetry, and silk-bound love letters. But she had always been the one in the background, too quiet, too plain, not enough sparkle to be considered worthy of courtship. Yet now, her name had been signed onto a contract sealed by her father's ambition. She was to marry a man she had never met, a farmer from the north. They said he was quiet, as if silence were something contagious. "You'll be safe," her mother had said. But safety, Evelyn knew, wasn't the same as being seen. Before we continue, subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this story from. Our goal is to reach more hearts with tales like this, and those who stay until the end are always the first to be remembered when new ones appear. So even if you're busy, let this story play all the way through. Her hands trembled as she packed her things. No one asked if she was ready. No one wondered how a girl raised in stillness was meant to face a lifetime of it. As the carriage door shut behind her, she felt a part of herself being locked away. Marriage is duty, they'd said. Love comes later or not at all. But what if that was the lie women were told to survive loveless lives? What if the truth was this, that some girls were never meant to be rescued, only passed from one silence to another? The road twisted like a question with no answer. Trees leaned in as if to whisper secrets she hadn't yet earned. Somewhere ahead, a cottage waited, and a man, and a life shaped by soil. Not society, but could she learn to grow in it? Could a heart trained in shadows ever bloom in the open? She didn't know. She only knew this: they had not chosen each other, but perhaps in time the silence would. The cottage stood alone at the edge of the woods, its stones aged by time and covered in ivy like secrets never spoken aloud. Evelyn stepped from the carriage into a silence so heavy it felt orchestrated. He was there, Thorn, standing with arms crossed, posture rigid, gaze unreadable. No greeting, no smile, only a nod, as if this were a transaction completed, not a life beginning. "You'll find the hearth warm," he said without meeting her eyes, and somehow that felt colder than the wind that followed her inside. The house smelled of pine, old books, and a sorrow that hadn't yet found a name. His voice echoed rarely, only when necessary. Meals were eaten with the scrape of silver and wood, not laughter. And Evelyn found herself wondering, had he been born this quiet, or had something broken him so deeply that even sound had abandoned him? What was a woman to do in a home where even the walls seemed to grieve? And more haunting still, what if marriage wasn't a place to grow love, but a graveyard for what love could have been? Days passed, each like a pebble dropped in a well with no bottom. She began to notice the way he avoided mirrors, the way he paused at her door at night, never knocking, never speaking. And once she caught him staring into the woods as if waiting for a ghost. Evelyn had entered the marriage with no illusions, but no illusions did not mean no hope. And now, hope was a dangerous thing, because it made silence scream louder. In that house of quiet, something was stirring. Not yet affection, but maybe recognition. The chapel was small, cold, built of grey stone and expectation. There were no guests, no music, no whispered blessings, just Evelyn in a dress borrowed from a cousin who married for love, and Thorn standing like a statue carved from restraint. The priest's voice trembled through the vows, as if even he felt the absence of something sacred. When the words, "Until death do you part," echoed off the walls, Evelyn wondered, was this a beginning, or simply the most elegant ending society had ever designed for women like her? He didn't kiss her. Not then. Just a nod again, as if sealing a deal. And yet something shifted when they returned to the cottage, not in him, but in her. She stood at the threshold, looked around the dimly lit room, and whispered to herself, "This is my world now." It wasn't a declaration of acceptance, but of surrender. But what choice does a woman have in a life written by other hands? Some cages were made of bars, others were made of politeness, custom, and gold. That night they lay in separate rooms, as strangers bound by ceremony. Evelyn stared at the ceiling, counting the wooden beams, pretending each one was a reason to stay. But the truth clawed at her ribs. She had been given away like a thing, not asked, not chosen. And as the wind howled outside, she whispered the question she hadn't dared voice aloud. What does it mean to belong to someone when you've never even belonged to yourself? In the silence, there was no answer. But it echoed anyway. Mornings became a ritual of absence. Evelyn would rise before the sun, not out of duty, but escape. She'd sit by the window, cup of tea untouched, watching the fog dissolve over the hills, as if hoping her thoughts might dissolve with it. Thorn was always already outside, working the land, as if motion could quiet memory. They shared meals, space, and silence, but not themselves. And still, something had shifted. A loaf of bread left warm for her. Her shawl folded with care, not perfection, not love, but presence. One evening, a storm rolled in, sudden and violent. Thunder cracked the air as Evelyn rushed to close the windows. That's when she saw him, soaked, breathless, pressing against the barn door to keep it from tearing off its hinges. She opened the cottage door and stood there, heart loud against her ribs. For a moment, their eyes met through the rain. He didn't speak, but he didn't look away. And in that second, she saw something that frightened her more than loneliness, familiarity. Later, he left a book by her door, a novel, pages dog-eared, spine worn. No note, no explanation. But the message was clear. I see you. Evelyn turned the first page, fingers trembling. Was this how it began? Not with declarations, but with small acts that asked for nothing in return. And yet, part of her resisted. Because if he saw her now, she'd have to admit she existed. And for so long, it had been easier to vanish than to be misunderstood. Easier to hide than to hope. The cough started as a whisper, brushed aside like a passing chill. But by the third day, Evelyn could no longer rise from bed. Her skin burned with fever, and her breaths came in shallow waves. Outside, winter clawed at the window panes. Inside, time slowed to the rhythm of pain. Thorn found her collapsed near the hearth, her hands cold, her eyes glazed with delirium. And something inside him cracked, not loudly, but like ice under pressure. He lifted her as if she were made of glass, not realizing she had always been. For 2 days, he barely left her side. Soup left untouched. Firewood restocked. A basin of cold water replaced every hour. He read to her, softly, clumsily, the same book he once left by her door. She drifted in and out of sleep. But in the haze, she heard him say things not meant for conscious ears. I never wanted a wife, he whispered, but I never wanted to lose one either. She didn't respond, couldn't. But her heart heard him, and suddenly the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things neither of them knew how to say. When she finally awoke, weak but breathing steady, he was asleep in a chair beside her bed, head tilted, one hand still wrapped around hers. She stared at him, really stared. The tension in his jaw, the lines carved by grief, the way his brow furrowed even in rest. Had he always looked this human? She didn't move, didn't speak, but something shifted, because illness has a way of stripping away pretense. And for the first time, Evelyn wondered if survival was more than breath. Maybe it was connection. She spoke first, not with poetry, but with truth. Why did you agree to marry me? The question hung between them like smoke, too dense to ignore, too dangerous to inhale. Thorn didn't answer immediately. He stood by the window, arms crossed, eyes fixed on a horizon that no longer offered escape. "Because I was told I needed a wife," he said at last, "and I thought choosing someone invisible would protect us both." It wasn't cruelty. It was confession. He had mistaken her silence for safety, as if two ghosts could build a home. Evelyn's fingers gripped the blanket, her voice steadier now. "And were you always this silent?" Thorn turned slowly. "No," he said. Just one word, but behind it lived 100 locked doors. He walked to the hearth, crouched, fed the flames, then sat without looking at her. "I used to speak too much, until I realized the world listens only to what confirms its comfort. And I was not comfortable." She understood then. He wasn't quiet by nature. He was quiet by survival, just like her. In that room, warmed by fire and fatigue, something unspoken broke free. They didn't touch, didn't cry, but they sat, not as prisoner and guard, not as strangers in shared space, but as two people haunted by what they'd once believed was strength. Silence. And Evelyn asked herself, what if vulnerability wasn't weakness, but the only form of courage left to the broken? That night, no vows were made. But when she turned out the lamp, she left the door between their rooms open. Just slightly. Just enough for breath to pass through. Spring came too early that year, melting the frost before the hearts were ready. With it came a letter, parchment sealed with her father's crest, summoning them to a gathering in the southern estate. Evelyn read it aloud with a calm she didn't feel. Thorn said nothing, only nodded, as if such obligations were inescapable as gravity. When they arrived, the manor seemed smaller somehow, though nothing had changed. Perhaps it was she who had grown larger, not in stature but in soul. But what happens when a woman no longer fits into the silence she was raised in? The drawing room was a theatre of performance. Her sisters, radiant in silks, whispered behind porcelain cups. Her father, ever the merchant of appearances, asked Thorn no questions, only observed. And then came the moment, a comment, casual but sharpened. "You've gained colour in your cheeks, Evelyn. The farm air must be tolerable." Laughter followed. Thorn remained still, but Evelyn, she stood taller. "It is not the air that changed me," she said, voice low, eyes steady. And in that silence, something ancient cracked. Later, by the balcony, her mother found her alone. "You've softened," she said, not kindly. "Marriage suits you." Evelyn turned. "No, it's truth that suits me. For the first time, I live in a place where silence is not used as a weapon." And as the wind curled around them, her mother looked away. Not out of guilt, but fear. Because women like Evelyn were not meant to return changed. They were meant to endure, smile, vanish. And yet here she stood, not broken, but translated. A language once forgotten, now spoken aloud. The letter was published in the local gazette. Anonymous, cruel, precise. The silent farmer with a broken past marries a woman no one else wanted. Pity dressed as romance. Evelyn found it on the doorstep, folded with intent. When she showed Thorn, his jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That night, at the village gathering, eyes followed them like moths to flame. Whispers trailed behind their every step. Because nothing threatens a quiet town more than a couple who refuses to perform their misery. A local merchant, red-faced with ale and arrogance, approached Thorn too closely. "Tell me, did she cry on your wedding night, or were you both too silent to notice?" Evelyn reached for Thorn's hand beneath the table, but it was too late. Thorn stood, fists curled. The room froze, but instead of striking, he spoke, clearly, slowly. "She is not mine to defend. She is her own." And in that instant, Evelyn felt the kind of safety she never thought possible. The kind that doesn't protect you like a cage, but trusts you to fight in open air. When they returned home, she wept, not from shame, but release. "They'll always find a reason to mock us," she whispered. Thorn, sitting beside the hearth, replied, let them speak, as long as we do not echo their lies inside ourselves." And Evelyn realized then, some wars are not fought with swords or silence. They are fought by standing upright in the room where you were once expected to kneel. That night, they did not make love, but they undressed the fear between them. And that perhaps was more intimate. Years passed, not loudly, but with the quiet insistence of roots beneath earth. The cottage changed. New beams, fuller shelves, a cradle carved by Thorn's own hands that sat near the window, long before a child would ever fill it. Evelyn had taken to writing, not novels, not yet, just pages filled with thoughts never spoken, questions that once haunted her. What is a home, if not a place where one's silence is finally understood? And what is legacy, if not the courage to break the cycle before it breaks you? They never spoke of love the way others did. No grand declarations, no rehearsed vows. But in the way she reached for his sleeve when startled, in the way he memorized which tea calmed her storms, they had become not each other's half, but each other's mirror. Imperfect, reflecting back what the other feared, needed, and slowly healed. The town stopped whispering, or maybe they just stopped listening. Either way, peace came, not as a gift, but as a decision, a rebellion made daily in the mundane. One morning, Evelyn found Thorn kneeling in the garden, teaching a neighbor's child how to plant rosemary. She stood at the doorway, watching, hand resting on her rounded belly, and thought, this was never about being chosen. It was about choosing. And perhaps that was the real romance no one ever told her about. Not the storm of passion, but the stillness after. Not the rescue, but the rebuild. In the soil, in the silence, in the story rewritten without permission, she had finally become the author. The child was born in spring, under skies the color of unspoken promises. They named her Elira, a name with no lineage, no burden, only breath. Thorn held her with hands once meant only for soil, now trembling with something he had never allowed himself to name. Evelyn watched him, then looked around the cottage. No longer a place she had been sent, but a world they had built. It struck her then. Love doesn't arrive. It is grown, word by word, wound by wound, not despite the past, but because of it. Years later, Evelyn stood before a group of young women in town, reading aloud from her first published novel. It was fiction, but everyone knew the truth behind the names. She paused mid-sentence, watching their faces, some curious, some wounded, all listening. And what if the silence you inherited was never yours to carry, she asked, not as a character, but as herself. The room didn't clap, it breathed. And in that breath she knew, her voice no longer trembled, it taught. That evening, as she and Thorn sat by the fire, older, weathered, unbroken, she asked, do you ever regret it, marrying me? Thorn turned, met her eyes and said, no, I regret waiting so long to speak. She smiled, not at the answer, but at the man he had become. And as the fire crackled, she returned to the very first line she had written, the one that began it all. She was told that silence was safety, but in truth, it was only ever the start of her story. And like all stories worth telling, it ended where it began. Elira grew up asking questions, not out of rebellion, but wonder. Why don't you and Papa have portraits like other families? Why do you smile when it rains? Evelyn always answered, though never directly. Some truths weren't told, they were lived. And in every pause before a reply, Elira learned the difference between noise and meaning. Because Evelyn had discovered something few ever do, silence is not the absence of power. It is its refinement. and her daughter would not have to learn that the hard way. There was a drawer in the study that Elira was forbidden to open, not out of secrecy, but reverence. When she turned 16, Evelyn handed her the key. Inside were journals, drafts, unfinished letters, and a single photograph. Evelyn and Thorn, standing side by side, unsmiling, but undeniable. On the back, in Evelyn's handwriting, "We built what we needed, not what we were told." Elira sat there for hours, reading the lives her parents had written in margins and between lines. And for the first time, she understood why her mother sometimes stared at nothing and smiled. One evening, after Thorn passed, Evelyn returned to the old chair by the hearth. The house was quieter than ever, and yet full. She picked up a worn page, the beginning of a new story, not hers, Elira's. She would write it differently, maybe louder, maybe brighter, but the ink would carry the same fire. And Evelyn, once invisible, once voiceless, whispered to the empty room, "May your silence never be mistaken for absence. May your softness never be confused with surrender." Then she closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. Years had turned to decades, and the world outside had shifted, faster, louder, less patient. But the cottage remained. It had been painted now, expanded slightly, yet the essence never left. Evelyn walked slower, thought deeper, smiled more. She no longer wrote to be heard, but to understand. In the quiet of dawn, she reread the first page she ever penned, about a woman who was forced to marry a stranger. She laughed gently. No one forces transformation, but life, it invites it, disguised as hardship, dressed as fate. On the final day, Elira returned with her own daughter, a girl named Solène. They sat by the fire, 3 generations in one room, the air thick with memory. "Solène, barely old enough to write," asked Evelyn, "were you always brave?" Evelyn blinked slowly. "No," she replied, "I was simply tired of being afraid." And in that answer, Solène heard not just a story, but a map. Because bravery isn't inherited, it's chosen, in moments, in whispers, in deciding to remain soft in a world that profits from your hardening. That night, Evelyn closed her last journal. No dramatic ending, no final revelation, just a single line. She was told that silence was safety, but in truth, it was only ever the start of her story, the very sentence that began everything. But now, it meant something else. Not a warning, a promise that every ending holds within it the seed of a beginning. If you found meaning in this story, in its quiet defiance, in its emotional depth, please subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can be born. Comment below where you're watching from. Your presence gives life to these characters, and if this touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember that even in silence, love can roar.